Welcome to this week's webinar of Space Today series hosted by Skyrora Limited. The aim of this series is to engage representatives from politics, academia and the industry in a challenging discussion surrounding new space sector. This week we'll discuss the topic of ladies in launch or women in space. To our viewers, Skyrora designs and manufactures and deploys rockets or small satellite manufacturers into orbit. And we're passionate about making space more accessible to future generations. Studies conducted in 2018 showed that approximately 24% of STEM careers are currently held by women, while a new survey done by one of the world's largest organizations dedicated to youth career readiness saw a decline in teenage boys who want a job in STEM, down from 36% to 24%. And the low level of interest among teenage girls remained unchanged at 11%. Between 2017 and 2018. Knowing how pivotal it is for STEM careers, whether it be for boys or girls going forward in the space industry, we'd like to get insights from our renowned speakers here today. So who we have with us here today are Laura Forzik. And Laura, has just dropped off, I believe. So hopefully Laura will come back. So I'll come back to Laura in a moment. We then have Natasha Alden, who's the founder and CEO of Multiply Space.
Afternoon.
Sandra Heggie, who's a TEDx speaker, time to think and strategic leadership coach. Vera Pinto from the European Commission, who deals with policy for equality in space.
Hi.
Leila Martin, who's a space theorist from Harvard University and the founder of the Astro Academy.
Good morning, everyone.
We also have, as you can see, a black square troll hunter. So those of you who joined us last week would have seen the unfortunate incident of people joining in just to send rather discolourful comments. So we've instigated a troll hunter on our behalf this week to help avoid any future progress with that. I'm just trying to wait for it to join back on here. Let's have a look. Okay, Laura has dropped off, but what we'll do, she was having some internet issues. Laura is an industry analyst, an author and owner consultant at Astro, and hopefully she will join the panel again once her internet is back with us. Oh, here she comes. And Laura's with us now. So thank you for joining us, Laura. So to start off today, what I would like to do is to ask the panel for their opinions. And so what inspired you to go into the field that you currently work in, and how did you get started in that? And if I can open that with Vera.
Sure. Thank you for the question, because I think it's always, it's the second time I'm asked this today, actually, how I got into space. And in fact, I come from social sciences, so I do not have a STEM background. You know, when I was a kid, my father and we used to play with stars. We use stars to connect dots. And later on, I remember that I started participating in amateurs astronomer groups to stargaze during the night, and I got into it very much. I started learning a lot. You know, I was so curious about everything, and I started learning a lot. But I was already in high school, almost at university, so I had already chosen my what I would follow for my studies. And then in 2004, in January, I was already working on my master's, and at lunchtime in the cafeteria of the university, I saw in the news George W. Bush announcing the space exploration vision. And as weird as it might seem, that was the moment that I thought, oh my God, I know what I'm going to do my master thesis on. Why not politics and space? One connects to each other, influences each other. You cannot do space without politics. So I'm going to do my master thesis in space policy. And so I proposed that, and it was accepted to university. So I started working on that. But of course, I'm Portuguese from background. And at the time, the Portuguese presence in space was insignificant almost. It was very small. There was already some steps, but there was not a true space policy even in the countries. So everyone was looking at me like I was an alien because I was speaking about space policy, and everyone was like, what is that all about? And so a few years later, when I applied for a job at the European Commission for the EU Space Program, and I start working in Galileo in a very technical unit. I was the only desk officer that was not non-technical. And so it was a great experience. So I'm working in the European Commission in the EU Space Program since. It's almost 7 years that I'm working with them. I learned so much, and I also realized that in space, you also need other professionals that are not coming from STEM. So we need lawyers, we need communicators, we need economists and so on. And so it's quite interesting to see that the multidisciplinary team that I work with also reflects the multidisciplinary of space. So this is how I end up in space, and I really love it. I usually say that my passion became my work, so I'm very lucky.
Thank you. Natasha, would you like to take on?
Yeah, absolutely. So my background was actually in digital, and I was involved, worked FTSE 100 side, doing digital propositions, involved in fintech, insurtech uprising, so absolute sort of cutting edge technologies, high growth, new industry, emergent industry creation. And it was 6 years ago, just coming up to 6 years ago, I got a call from an old contact who said, didn't even say hello, how are you? Just went, do you want to come and play with rocket cars? Now, I'm a grown up, I have a mortgage, so I immediately went yes. And that took me into my first project with Multiply, which was the British Land Speed Record Team. They were developing a supersonic car to go 1,000 miles an hour, and obviously as part of that was the rocket capability. And the thing which got me is when I first saw the car is the aerodynamics, the chassis, the engine, the system, the value, the opportunity and the potential that resided in that bit of tech, not only just from a systems and process point of view, but from IP and core tech, I realized was untapped. There was huge opportunity, and that's what inspired me to continue down very advanced engineering technologies. And hence moving on to turbo pumps for small launch vehicles. We've done thermal heat exchangers, we've done robotics, but it's all about seeing the potential opportunity. And so 6 years ago, I was tempted to the dark side of rocketry and haven't looked back since.
Excellent. Leila, would you like to take next?
Yes, thank you. So first I'd like to say good morning at 7 o'clock here in Los Angeles. So if I seem a little bit more legally blonde than Harvard, you'll know why. I've also been sick for 2 weeks. So I committed to doing this panel, but I didn't want to cancel, but it's sick and early. So I'm going to do my best here in terms of what inspired me to go into the space sector. Like Vera, I come from a creative background, and so I'm not an engineer. I was an international relations major at Harvard, and trying to search in exactly like what area I would specialize in. And a colleague of mine at the Pentagon, he was talking to me about how space is not as infinite as we think, like geostationary orbit, and it's finite in these lucrative orbital slots. And we started talking about the politics of space, and I found that to be absolutely fascinating, that space is not just engineering and rocket building, that there's so much more in terms of the global politics that goes into space, and there's so much to consider. And I felt it was like just amazing. It was so exciting, so inspiring. And so I've been working in astropolitics now for 2 years, interviewing key leaders within the field and developing my theory of astrofeminism. So it's really exciting. I think there's a lot to look forward to, and there's a lot more depth than people initially think. So
that's great. And Sandra, from someone who's outside of the space industry, could you pass your point of view across?
Yes, thank you, Derek, and thanks everyone for being here and inviting me. Thanks to Skyrora for that. And already I feel much more comfortable hearing the stories of Vera, Natasha, and Lila, because I really felt just a few minutes ago sort of out of space. But now hearing those stories, I feel like I want to work in space already. So I think if we go back maybe to the last question, if we're going to finish this webinar, you know, why do you want to work in space? I mean, hear Vera, Natasha, and Lila talk about it, and I think a lot of people will be pretty keen or motivated to hop on that bus. And I have my background in pharmaceutical business. I'm not a specialist in terms of pharmaceuticals, but I'm a specialist in working in pharmaceutical business. And I do a lot of strategy building. I did a lot of, around change management. And alongside all the different jobs I had, especially the last 18 years within Johnson & Johnson, I did a lot of change management, program management, and alongside of that, a lot of work around diversity and inclusion. So that's the reason why I'm here and hoping to bring in just a different flavor.
Excellent, thank you very much. Well, the next question I'm going to tweak slightly from what it would have been put across to you earlier is, what do we need to do to make space sciences more attractive? The question was originally more attractive to women, but given that the statistics earlier showed 11% hasn't moved for women and ladies in STEM careers and sort of looking to go towards it, and men have dropped, how do we just reinvigorate the entire industry to encourage everyone back into these STEM careers? Who would like to start?
I can start. I think that, yes, maybe there's more women going into the space sector STEM careers right now, but if you look at the World Economic Forum, the Global Gender Gap Index, there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. And I think one very obvious solution, you can hear a siren going by, that's great, is that childcare. So as a mother of 4, I have not been able to get to the PhD level, and I don't think I will, because I need to go out there and work. And so trying to balance a career and staying in school. So a lot of the jobs within STEM, you require a PhD. And so I think that the lack of childcare for women to be able to attain a PhD to get to that level is a major hurdle. And I think that if we offered a higher quality childcare that was reasonably priced within the academic environment, that more women would attain a PhD, and then that would allow them to reach those type of positions that we're shut out of for the most part.
I would like to add something on what just Lila said that is also a bit representative of just the point she made, is that if you look at the numbers within the STEM persons in Europe, you see that the European Union average is actually, the ratio is 51% men, 49% women. So, and of course, if you look at national level, you have bigger differences, but this is the average at European level. But then when you look at this and you see who goes to the industry and who goes more to the service sector, it's completely the opposite. Men are overrepresented in industry, and the gap is much less in the service part. And it's also because there's more women in the public institutions, for example, and one of the reasons is because of the conditions they have, because there is legislation at European level and at national level that, you know, equal pay for equal work, you have more flexibility that applies independent of your gender and so on. And so women have more flexibility if they are in a public sector, working in space, in research and so on, than they would have if they would be in the industry. And this is every time I see the statistics, the first thing that comes to my mind is this traditional role of the woman as a caregiver and the lack of conditions if you are in the private sector. And although the legislation exists, And I think in Europe, at European level, we really have very good legislation to give a push for women equality. It is true that not every country has the same level of implementation, and then private companies are lacking behind.
That's a good point, Vera. What I noticed in the environment that I worked in the pharmaceutical industry is that due to the huge growth, also working on a global level, you can imagine J&J is a huge company, and you have all these different countries connected to each other. People used to travel a lot, and especially in these days, we really value, let's say, the lack of travel. And that is also let's say, a positive side, that we get more and more the experience to work digitally, to work on a distance, yet appreciating the capabilities and the competencies that every individual can bring into that organization. So whether you're male or female, I think especially for females, it's important to understand, and hopefully companies can contribute to that, to say, okay, what does it take for you to show your maximum capacity in order to drive the value of a company? So if you think about that question, then it could be maybe childcare, but maybe it could be working from home more, or it could be downsizing the less of time of travel you have going to the office, enabling and making a difference between being there physically and being there available. So sometimes you don't need to be there, but you have to be available, but you can still drop off the kids somewhere. So you're still available. So it's also a bit on, okay, how do you interact as an employee versus the leadership of your company in moving forward into that?
Can I be provocative now?
Yes.
Why does it need be the woman to drop off the kids?
Oh no, it could be anyone, but I think the arrangement is exactly the same for men. Yeah. And as long as all the options are provided, every employee can make their own choices how they want to organize it.
Yeah, you see already in some European countries some changes on, for example, on what concerns parental leave, that can be the mom or the father to take it and to use it. And I think we need more of this also, so that the couple can also divide the tasks, and so that it's not always the woman that needs to cook and to take the kids out and all of this. Like I see it as a team, so it means everyone can contribute for it.
I think also childcare is just one aspect that's important. It's really more important to bring up the idea that women lack power in outer space governance policy and priorities. For example, the director of the United Nations Office for Outer Space Affairs is a woman. Okay, it's a very diverse group, but how much power do they have in terms of what we're doing in the private sector? How the money is being allocated towards new projects. So although women are certainly in the space sector, and even if we talk about childcare and we figure that out, and they're appointed directors and they have great titles, what is the power? What ideas and policy and priorities are being carried out? I think power is a much more important topic to think about, more than childcare, in terms of how to fix this.
How to make women to reach boards, for example. Considering
even if
that
they're on the board,
and
even if they're on the board, do they have power?
Do they have the same power as if it would be a man?
Or I think Blue Origin, there's a female on the board or CEO in power. She's in a high position, but what about the decisions that the company is making? Like, I think it's really important, again, to look at it. Simply because you put a woman in the room doesn't mean she's in a position of power.
Exactly. I agree. And it's also, you can tell, early this year, every year in January, there's a very high level space conference in Brussels. And you can see that the panels, we struggle a bit to make the panels as diverse as possible, especially because there's no women in high level positions in Europe.
because
space
it's very hard to finish the PhD, and it goes, there's a lot of moving parts. Exactly.
Sorry, I'll jump over there. I can see Natasha was looking to say something.
That's fine. I just sort of picking up on a few points. I mean, back to the sort of the core question of how do we make space more accessible and encouraging for boys and girls to join based on the STEM rates. And I think I completely agree with Layla. There is support mechanisms that need to go in place for both genders. That could be a flexible working consideration, remuneration, parental care, all of those aspects, and it does need to mature in today's world. And I, just from a UK perspective, what I'm observing in the conversations I'm having with a number of business owners, from SMEs through to large, is they are looking, this has sort of pushed that agenda item up, and they are looking at much more flexible ways of working, being able to go, actually, this is possible. We're all in the same boat. How can we work smarter? And I think there's a working smarter piece, which I'm being reassured at the moment with the UK is seriously being considered. But I think there's another aspect, and I think it's, again, slightly ties into this power thing, but really it's what you said earlier, Vera, about multidisciplinary. Space is such a fantastical thing. When you say space, they see astronauts and comet books and rockets. It's like, oh, that sounds fun, wow. And they walk away. How many times have you spoken to somebody who said, I work in space? And you can just see them going, eyes glazed, they all get a little bit and back off. It's helping them understand that it is as any other industry. We're just not sending a car down a road, we're sending a car up into space with a bit more fuel behind it. But it's showing the multidisciplinary pieces. And I think that would open up the doors, as you said, Vera, to sort of communicators, to leaders. We need policy advice, we need this. But if they're not shown that there are those opportunities, again, across both genders, then of course it's very hard for them to pursue something they can't envisage.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Excellent.
It's why STEM? So it's like relevance of STEM for them is it for people like me? If I speak with some people, like you said, they get like, oh, space, oh my God. The perceivability is like, do I feel confident to work in this area? If the idea is always that it's just rocket science kind of thing, of course, immediately the people, oh no, it's too complicated for me. I cannot do it. And then it's also a question of seeing the pathways and all the possibilities that going and pursuing STEM education might bring to them, or even if it is not STEM itself, but if you try to see how your degree and space can interconnect, and if you are able to see these possibilities and where you can work, because again, space is not just engineers, then it will make them more easy to bring them on board.
Absolutely.
Another question for you, for the panel. So I think what's good about this one is that you all come from a different background originally before going working with space or space companies in some form or another, and have all dealt with some sort of form of leadership. So what changes should we actively be making to benefit from broader diversity in the space sector, whether that be the UK, Europe, or the US? Sandra, would you like to start?
Yeah, it's a challenging question because there's a risk that the answer is going to be too big and too large and too much of an extent to the issue. In basic, I would say if we want to benefit more of what women have to offer in whatever industry you are, you have to start with appreciating diversity. And it also starts with appreciating the diversity between people, like you just mentioned, Derek. We all have a different background here. We come from different countries, from a different educational path, different careers, different personalities, different styles. So even then, if we talk about developing women into an industry, it starts with appreciating diversity. And that's on the work floor, that's in your department, that's on who you share your room with, or with within the company, or what your board of directors are showing in meetings. If diversity has not been recognized, it's very difficult to support women into their career or get talented women in your organization, because they immediately sense that there is something wrong.
I think it's a really, sorry, go on, Sandra.
Oh no, please go ahead.
And the diversity thing, I agree. It's sort of recognizing diversity, and people who I don't often do a lot of women in activities, but I'm very interested to explore this. And as a company, we have a set of values, and diversity is one of those core value sets. It does not mean colour, religion, sex at all. When we talk about diversity and multiply, we talk about the person, their experiences, how they think, what their drivers are. That for me is a diversity piece. And I agree, it's a leading by example and just doing. And to me, true diversity is when it's a non-issue, it's not even spoken about. And particularly not at a gender level or a race level, it's recognized as a person and experience or different experiences. For me, that's the core. And in order to really make those changes, you have to lead by example by not highlighting it as a problem which acts as a crutch or an excuse, but highlighting it as an opportunity to make it something that we don't need to be discussing in 5-10 years time.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
To add to that, Natasha, I think it's one. Sorry, Vera. To finish my story, if you have, let's say, women on this level, and you say, okay, we need the recognition of diversity. But how do you do that? How do you get there? Whatever diversity means to you, because I think you have different levels in that, and it starts with inclusion. If you do not start with inclusion in your organization, meaning paying attention to each other, ask each other questions, showing an interest into each other, then all those signals of inclusion can lead to acceptance of diversity.
So I'd like to say something about this. I have been interviewing thought leaders in aerospace and defense for 2 years, and Iris Bonet is the Dean of Harvard Kennedy School, and her work on bias really, I think, is applicable here. I actually talked to Derek about diversity and inclusion as I was developing my theory of Astro feminism, and after 2 years with all these different interviews, I thought, why aren't I filming this? And this can be part of a series to help different aerospace and defense organizations understand how diversity and inclusion, how we can have new approaches. Because I think for me, the bias is really one of the cornerstones, that and Kimberly Crenshaw's theory of intersectionality, meaning that we have all these cross-cutting cleavages. I'm a creative director. I don't think I would have ever come up with this idea of astrofeminism, applying feminist theory to space policy, had I been an engineer. It's not to say that people haven't applied feminist theory to space policy before, but in terms of coining the term and developing the theory and building it out, there are all these female theorists where the diversity and inclusion piece, you can say something different. And I agree with Natasha. It's not about how we have to check and hire more women and these people of color. It's not that. It's really about reframing how we look at things and the bias that we have within ourselves. And gender bias is one of, the most major things, in motherhood bias and all the motherhood penalty. I mean, there's so much that you can talk about in terms of helping people understand that they're biased. And as I started doing this work with Dr. Bonet at the Harvard Kennedy School, I had a conversation with her, and I had to admit, as a mother with 4 children, 3 boys, 1 girl, I was biased in some of the way that I expected my daughter to take care of things or help out more. And I was just like, oh my gosh, if I'm thinking about it and I'm aware of it, and I'm doing it, I was like, think about all of the work we can do to help people understand that they just need these small shifts in the way that they're considering everything in terms of working together, working on projects, deciding who is getting to look at new projects, in aerospace and defense, how are we allocating all the funds? And it's like, just the bias is a really important piece there. So yep. I think this is a great topic.
I totally agree on that. And actually, the first thing that comes to my mind is like, everyone should have a training on unconscious bias, because we all have them. We all have them. Mm-hmm. We might not be aware, but we all have them. And even in, like you mentioned, in things in our personal life, we are biased. And so it's important to identify them and try to overcome, to work with them and go around and to turn them into something positive. Mm-hmm. And I also agree with Natasha, what he was saying, that diversity, it's more than female and male. There's much more than that. Also because you have a lot of intersections that you also need to take into account. And even on, the companies cannot just go and let's do an diversity and inclusion assessment of our company and do an action plan, but then it is not meaningful. It needs to bring and to include people, like Sandra was saying, that everyone needs to speak to each other. Everyone needs to be part of the team. And this diversity in the way of the personalities, the way of thinking, and the backgrounds, and the cultural background, and so on, is what makes it's what brings innovation, I think. It is really a plus. Is these different ways of seeing life and living it and experiencing it that brings innovative solutions. And we need that in space.
Thank you very much. Well, I think that leads perfectly on to our next set of questions, which we've got here. I can see some questions are coming in. If we've got some time at the end, I'll try and direct them to the panel as well. So the next question I've got here is, what do you think are the next steps in space exploration? Technology transfer, risk reduction, environmental sustainability? Natasha, would you like to kick off?
Yeah, absolutely. So space exploration, that's the fun side, that's the sexy side of space. That's not the data pipes where all the money is made. That's the fun bit. I think I would sort of talk about it a little bit more broadly than just space exploration, because the next step is a stabilization, in my view, of the industry. I'm talking from a bit more of a European viewpoint on this later, so it'd be really interesting to hear from the US side on this. It's ironic for the age the industry is, but it is a relatively young, emergent industry. It's still very predicated on government funding, significant projects. It's not commercially generating and sustainable in its own right yet, very close. And to really enable not only exploration, but broader space capabilities, there needs to be a whole infrastructure and stabilization in place. And there's three sort of core things. One is around regulations and frameworks, and there's a huge amount of work going on around that. So if we're doing space exploration, okay, we go down to the dark side of the moon, find some lithium cobalt, that's absolutely fine, or we go onto an asteroid. Who has the right to the asteroid? The existing space law is nobody has the right to the land, but there is loopholes around having rights to resources. So it's getting all of that really matured and formalized. So that's core one. Moving to more of a commercially sustainable model. I mean, this is sort of one of the core tenets of what we do, is enabling companies to remove from pure public funding dependencies to commercially sustainable entities. When you've got commercially sustainable companies in an industry, you've got a sustainable, resilient industry. And then the third core thing is the development of that supply chain. And again, I think this is actually slightly back to how do we encourage people to have a career in space? How do we encourage people to do business with space? I think actually some similar barriers apply. And being able to get terrestrial applications or knowledge or skills to be able to help build those supply chains for space exploration, for example. So if we take asteroid mining, you need the mining companies, you need the lawyers, you need the communicators, you need the regulators, etc., etc. So supply chain, regulation, commercial, I think is core sustainable requirements for sustainability.
Natasha, I think you bring up some really excellent points, and I think the idea of a modern space code is really, it's so critical. The Outer Space Treaty ratified in 1967 is outdated, and this ad hoc space governance, I believe it's setting us up for disaster. And so I think that's number one, is a modern space code, a global space code that's tying in the different space agencies around the world, as well as the private sector, because as we're having all these companies launch more and more satellites, and it's like when there is a issue or, orbital debris or all these different things, and how is it handled? And it just can't be these separate groups. If you look at the Outer Space Office, United Nations Outer Space Office, it's like a labyrinth. I mean, it's very confusing in terms of the way that everything is managed. There are all these little groups, and so I think that's a really important point. And I just want to say, I see in the chat that Nuria is asking about the imposter syndrome, and if we have time, I would love to address that. after
I agree.
talk, or now I can just say briefly because this is a really important question. Is that okay, Derek?
If the rest of the panel are happy, go in with it. If I'm quite happy for
So I just have something. I got accepted into Harvard, and one of the first things I asked my advisor is, what about the imposter syndrome? What if people find out I'm not smart enough? I shouldn't be here. It's a mistake. And she said, I said, is this normal? That I always feel like they're gonna find out that I don't know the answer. And she said, yes, it's a sign of intelligence that you're aware, the self-awareness that you don't know. And typically very high achieving women suffer from imposter syndrome. And so I would just say that it's something that I struggle with, and especially being in the space sector with a non-engineering background, I always feel like they're going to ask me something that I don't know the answer to. And so I learned just to say, I don't know the answer to that. That's okay. But I do know a lot of things. And so I think that's a great question. And it's a sign that you are very bright.
Leila, I just would like to tell you that I feel exactly that. Exactly. It's like, what if they ask me something that I don't understand? What if I go to a meeting and I'm not able to understand what they are talking because it's too technical? And, you know, and I totally see myself on your words.
And you think if you get into Harvard, it proves you're smart. No, you're around people that are so smart that you always feel dumb. And so it's so funny, you never get there. No matter how smart you are, no matter what you achieve, I'm always thinking they're going to find out. And they're like, you're the theorist, you're coining these terms, you're doing all this stuff. And I'm like, I know, but there's so much I don't understand. So it never ends. And so that's there's no stamp of approval, except maybe if you're like Carl Sagan or something. I don't know. But
maybe he also felt it, you know? I totally agree with you.
That men, I don't think they struggle with it as much. And that goes back into, if you look at Iris Bonet's book about gender and bias, that we're constantly told we're not enough. If you just walk into any pharmacy and it's all like, look at all the stuff you could do to fix yourself. And so if men were dealing with that, navigating that world every day, I think it would be different. So I think that's a great question.
I'm very happy that you shared that, because I feel that every day too. And I like the perspective you brought. It is like, I just feel that because I'm actually very smart. It's actually a good point.
Just means you're smart.
Yeah, exactly. And self-aware, that is also very important.
So,
I would just like to pick up on what we were discussing before, because I agree. Natasha points that she brought, is really very important, and it's something that it needs to be taken into account. And also the policy lab rats that we live in is also true. It also happens at European level. Sometimes it's even very difficult to find it. But I would like to bring also maybe a different perspective, and to show, like I said, my master thesis was about how policy and space interlink with each other. And on your question, you mentioned something about environmental sustainability. This is actually something currently that I'm working, but on the space perspective, is that usually we see space as an enabler to improve environmental sustainability in other sectors, like the transport sector, for example, in agriculture and so on. And this is quite important, and space really has a huge contribution. But then if we look at the upstream, and if you look, for example, at one of the priorities of the new commission that start working on 1st November 2019, one of these biggest priorities is the European Union Green Deal. And part of the package of the Green Deal is that the European Union, meaning all the countries, 27 now, they will need to be climate neutral by 2050. And so for this, the European Commission has proposed an European climate law, turning the political commitment into a legal obligation. And of course, to trigger also investment in more sustainable and environmental friendly technologies, industry, and so on. But this also means that the space sector will need to look at this. We'll need to see, because if you are operating under the EU member states, you will need to be compliant with this legislation. You need to work to achieve this. And when we speak about, I I can give you the example, for example, of the Galileo satellites. They are built in Germany, they are shipped to Netherlands, and then they go to French Guiana on the other side of the planet. Of course, this also has an environmental impact that needs to be taken into account. And so, and when you look at the current methodologies to do environmental assessments, they are not, they do not take into account the specificities of the space sector. So when we are going to do legislation, we need to see how the space sector and this environmental legislation is going to work, because we might end up ending in having a big blockage at space industry because of these specificities that are not taken into account. And in Europe, for the years to come, and especially in the next 5 years, that we will be working, the European Commission will be working hard on the Green Deal. This is something that we need to look for. Maybe we will need to develop new standards that apply to space, or maybe new methodologies to do the environmental assessment of the space sector, but this will need to come, and the industry will need to adapt.
I agree. Just briefly to add on to that, there's also the sustainability in the space environment as well. Debris removal, we have a congestion problem. And I mean, from the UK, it was very recently announced there is a new fund they are pushing through, which includes robotics as a key, or in-space robotics as a key opportunity around the Innovation Space Programme, which is great to see. But I think, again, it's a sign of an industry that is growing mature, that isn't just onto launching a rocket, putting a satellite into orbit. It's going, how are we going to deorbit this? What is the life of this? How can we maximize the value and refuel it? How can we ensure that we're launching locally? That's, for me, I'm starting to hear it, which is fabulous, but is a sign of a more mature industry. And I think it's naturally going to happen, but in particular, as a global community, the space environment needs to be absolutely core to what we're doing, and an obligation on anyone launching, deploying in space.